Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today with the topic on education, inclusive growth, and fiscal consolidation. And we have our speaker today, Mr. Peter Courtney, who is an economics PhD candidate at Tinbergen Institute and Vrije University, Amsterdam. And you're also doing his research at the Stellenbosch University. And he will be taking us through this topic today. As we all know that education is really a key driver for any economic growth. So Peter will be taking us through his paper, and then he will delve deeper into this topic. And I'm going to hand over to you, Peter. You can take us through this session.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Ubuntu. So today I'll be presenting on education policy for inclusive economic growth during fiscal consolidation. This was a project with SA Tide and some affiliation with the end tails of Operation Vulindlela. I'm affiliated with Stellenbosch University, where I'm doing my PhD in economics, and Vrije University, and then at the bottom of this page, you can find my website where I'll post these slides at the end of this presentation sometime today. So the goals of this presentation roughly are to overview the state of education in South Africa, propose targeting learners who reach university but are unlikely to finish. I think this is the most important key proposal in this research is who in the education system needs to be targeted. So these are people on the threshold of becoming tax-paying adults in the future, but who never do in our economy defined by structural unemployment. And I claim or propose or look at the literature and try and say that early grade literacy and numeracy are often a part of the explanation. And then we move to 9 key policy recommendations. And these slides are a little bit word heavy, but I've produced them to be distributed for reference. So why this orientation towards these towards university graduates? Simply, South Africa is defined by extremely convex returns to schooling. So this means that the return in terms of income or reduction in unemployment for an additional year of education is much, much higher for university graduates than it is at any other stage in the education system. So my claim is that employment should be the primary aim of education policy. And a year without matric offers no income or employment returns. So it's very important that we are leveraging the education system to produce university graduates. The introduction of the GEC in grade 9 will provide some certification, and perhaps we will this will create some legibility of completion in high school, but seeing as even getting a matric doesn't confer nearly as large an advantage as university, my work here proposes that it's really university that we need to target. And we can see that the returns to university are not only high, but they are actually increasing as per Tim Kohler's work. And yeah, as I've said, the proposition here is to expand the tax base and make education fiscally sustainable. This is the key thing here in our current fiscal environment. The focus should shift to those on the cusp of completing university. And just to bring this home, South Africa is amongst the highest countries in the world for the returns to education because of this extraordinary return in university. A myth I just want to try and get out of the way to convince that employment really is the appropriate goal of education policy, and employment is driven ultimately by GDP growth. So growth is what we're aiming for here. And to motivate for this, I show this figure where we can see that the South African economy has more or less been defined by two periods, a period of growth and a period of stagnation. And during the period of growth, it was the only period where we saw substantial employment gains, and the period of stagnation post-2008 is when we have seen the stagnation and ultimately the reduction in employment. This is employment as a percentage of the population above 15. And human capital and education is now widely regarded as perhaps the primary driver of long-run economic growth. To put this in the budgetary environment, basic education budget has slightly declined, at least to 2022 per learner, and also as a percent of non-interest expenditure, it's basically remained stagnant, and it's set to rise now due to grade R expansion, but whether it'll rise per learner is yet to be seen. Unlike basic education, post-secondary education has seen a very large increase in expenditure. It's increased 56% between 2014 and 2024, so that's a 56% increase. And to put this in an international perspective, South Africa spends 30% more on education as a percent of total expenditure than the average upper middle income country. So we really do spend a lot of money, and my claim here is that the faults in the education system are not financial, not fiscal. So where does this money go? Well, the vast majority of this money goes to educator salaries. So 10% of all government spend goes to the basic education wage bill, which is quite remarkable. So in 2021, according to Persol data, the average teacher earned 43,000 Rand per month in 2021 and 38,000 Rand per month in 2012. So this is benched to 2021 Rands. So this is in real terms. To put this in perspective, according to some of the more recent research on the income distribution in South Africa using SARS data by Willard and Bessier, the top 3% of South African earners in 2014 earned 42,500 per month in 2021 Rands. So of those who are earning money, if you are earning above 43,000 Rand per month, then you're comfortably in the top 3% of South Africans. Educator salaries have also increased quite dramatically between 2007 and 2021. They've increased by 66%. This was in large part because of a change in the occupation-specific dispensation and how teachers were remunerated. And this has meant that the South African educators are paid 5 times GDP per capita. Unfortunately, this data is quite outdated, but most recent OECD data I could find showed that the highest country amongst the OECD is only paying 2 times GDP per capita, and the average is almost exactly GDP per capita. On top of this, there's some very robust literature in the economics of education that shows that increasing salaries doesn't improve learning. So this was some research in Indonesia that showed that exogenous, it was actually a total doubling of teacher salaries did not lead to improved learning outcomes. And similarly, decreasing salaries hasn't impeded it. And then if we move to Kenya, lower paid contract teachers internationally outperform, particularly permanent or unionized teachers. I don't think reducing or even maintaining teacher salaries is within political possibility, but I think it's nonetheless important to put teacher salaries in international perspective, because the two most common myths about education everywhere on planet Earth is that teachers are underpaid and there are not enough teachers. So South Africa has done well to at least buck any possible claim of that. On top of that, What return are we getting from our teachers? So it's quite a sensitive, difficult issue to work out the teacher performance. The most recent data we have was SACMEC 4, which assessed teachers in their subjects. So it assessed reading teachers in reading and maths teachers in maths. And South Africa performed quite poorly even in the African context. So only 37% of reading teachers achieved mastery in their subject and 41% of maths teachers. And often it's supposed that mastery is a prerequisite to be able to teach the subject you are teaching. And even if you control for the level of mastery, our students underperform what would be expected for this given level of teacher content knowledge. Yeah, so then in deeper analysis of this to try and benchmark these results to international, or rather to the learner assessments, of 60% of grade 6 maths teachers have content knowledge below grade 6 learner standards in international exams. If we move to how this knowledge is distributed, we can see that there is a substantial age component. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with the devastating history of education in South Africa, and this has left deep recapitulating scars on educators. So those roughly educated under apartheid who are now in the older cohorts perform substantially less well than younger teachers who had exposure to the democratic education system. And this means that the gap in teacher knowledge between those under and over 35 exceeds the gap between the knowledge of teachers in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, the two provinces with the largest gap. So age is more defining of teacher content knowledge than province. We also, RECEP and Stellenbosch University has worked quite a lot on a coming wave of teacher retirements. So it does seem like we're in a window where there will be quite a big churn in who's employed. But again, these data are quite old, 2013, so we don't really know if this pattern has persisted. The occupation-specific dispensation notches, which are how educators are remunerated, they were designed to incentivize retention of educators who were best performing. I think improved learning outcomes is a bit strong, but they were designed at least to follow a kind of remuneration similar to what would be seen for good performance in any or in perhaps the private or public sector. Unfortunately, that has not occurred, and instead, more than 95% of teachers get automatic progression along the OSD notches. What this entails is that the salaries, which we saw previously, are heavily defined by the age of the educator. So typically it was about a 1.5% above inflation, which of course exponentiates if you receive it every year of your employ as a teacher. So what this has meant is that the where the incentive structure of teacher salaries lies is on teachers with older teachers who have taught for the longest period of time, which at least by the SACMEC data suggest are not necessarily the teachers we would like to be incentivizing at a national structural level. So one of the big myths about South African education is that there hasn't been much improvement since apartheid, and this could not be more wrong. So if we look at this figure, we can see a series of international assessments. So this is a nationally representative sample of learners who write assessments that are administered and graded by international institutions, and this allows for comparability both across countries and over time. And if we peg these assessments to the year the learner entered grade 1, we can see that a learner who entered grade 1 in 1981 would have had a Pearls or TIMS assessment score of just over 250. And by the time a learner was entering school in 2004, this had increased to more than 350, extraordinary improvement. So I've kind of categorized these into 3 phases. We had pre-democracy stagnation, at least as much as we could tell. There weren't that many assessments to get a good sense at a nationally representative level of what was happening before the end of apartheid. And then we had a decade of extraordinary improvement. And since then, we had a pre-pandemic stagnation and a subsequent pandemic learning losses. But it's worth noting that this period of rapid improvement was very short-lived, and we never exceeded the low international benchmark. So this benchmark represents reading for meaning and calculating with confidence in the foundation phase, the kind of foundational level of literacy and numeracy needed for basically all other learning. To just bring this home, how dramatic this improvement was, these figures put South Africa's percent change in learning outcomes in the various periods of the Pearls and TIMS assessments. And we can see that during this 10 years of improvement, South Africa was comfortably in the top 15, top 20 fastest ever periods of improvement for any country who takes TIMS or Pearls, which is quite an extensive number of countries. So in reading, for example, only Egypt between 2016 and 2021, Poland between 2011 and 2016, and Israel between 2006 and 2011 have ever seen more rapid improvement. So this has been spoken of as South Africa approaching at least over this period, approaching the systems level improvement speed limit. What might be seen as the most improvement we might hope for, coming off an extraordinarily low post-apartheid or apartheid base. So I just think amongst a lot of education pessimism, it's important to note we have achieved and can achieve substantial improvements. Why did these improvements occur? It's hard to know exactly, but it's very likely that the school nutrition program, which is quite world-leading, and the Rainbow workbooks had a large part to play. And yeah, despite this progress, it's hard to know if these improvements were from low-hanging fruit, and that the next stage of improvement is going to be more difficult. So basically pushing more rapidly across the literacy and numeracy thresholds. Poland and Vietnam have achieved faster improvements, so there's and they started from a higher level of learning, so there's certainly hope. This brings us to something less hopeful, quite pessimistic, really. South Africa had the largest learning losses in reading in Pearls over the pandemic. So this is a percent learning loss in IRT scores. So IRT scores are just basically a score that is comparable between countries and over time. And during the pandemic, South Africa erased 10 years of learning progress, by far the worst reduction of any country in the Pearls assessments. We can't exactly attribute this to the pandemic. There might be other things. As I say, we saw a stagnation before the pandemic in maths and TIMS. There's a paper I have with Nick Spall investigating why that happened. And it's not due to compositional changes or something in the learner backgrounds. It does seem to be a true stagnation. And yeah, we don't have any other nationally representative, psychometrically valid assessments to know exactly what happened at the national level during the pandemic. To move on to equality, how equal is the progress been? Well, at least in pearls and language, all the improvement we've seen at a statistically significant level has occurred in the African languages. So I have a paper here with Mpumi Mohlotwane trying to understand why this happened and yeah, how we can continue these trends. Unfortunately, the next round was the pandemic round. So much of these improvements were reversed. And to nail exactly what this inequality looks like, so we can see that on the y-axis here, we have within country Gini. So this is a measure of the inequality within learning. So it can be thought of as something like the difference between the learner at the middle of the pack and the learner in the top 5%, or something like that. Except it looks across the whole distribution. So it's a full measure of how unequal learning was. This is not to be confused with income or wealth, Gini. It's the same mathematical principle applied to learning. And in 2016, although we had the highest level of inequality amongst Pearl's countries, it was in line with what would be linearly expected from our reading score. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. And over the pandemic, inequality widened dramatically, likely because of unequal school closures and unequal access to technology. Yeah, and basically alternatives to schooling, which is also kind of, in some sense, reassuring to know that you know, amongst so much education pessimism, it is dramatically bad for the average South African student if they lose access to the education system. So more on equality. Returning to this idea that we need to be producing future taxpayers to create a sustainable education system, there has been a downward trend in the number of maths A's achieved in matric and an increase in the maths lit passes. This also holds for normal maths. It's less dramatic, and since about 2017, we've seen quite a lot of improvement for both. Of course, these assessments are not comparable across time, so it's hard to know exactly what these trends are saying. But the critical thing here is that if we think of maths A's as the engine of future taxpayers, South Africa has a fairly exceptionally redistributive education and tax system. So if we are not producing enough taxpayers to fund this redistribution, the consequences for the worst off are very dramatic. Yeah. And again, well, to highlight how extraordinary inequality is in South Africa and remains, the top 200 high schools by the number of A's achieved are achieved between 0.9 and 1.7 times the number of A's as all other high schools combined. So that's saying something like the top 200 high schools in maths, if they are producing 500 A's in maths in the entire country, there will only be typically 1,000 A's in maths. So the inequality in the system suggests that the future taxpayers are really particularly assuming that, with good assumption, with good reason, that these are the entrants into university which are producing the aggregate extraordinarily high returns for university education. These 200 schools are clearly a very important driver of economic growth in South Africa. Yeah, and all I'll say about this is that the Bureau of Economic Research and others are motivating that these schools should be capacitated to increase their enrollment very dramatically, particularly for bright learners from no-fee schools who are likely to slip through the cracks if they are not empowered to go to one of these highly functional high schools. So the idea being in grade 6 or 7, how can we identify the best learners and take them to this handful of highly effective schools. Then we move on to class size. So class size is quite a complicated, difficult thing to really wrap one's head around, but basically there are various dynamics pushing everything in different directions. So basically what we can see here, if we look at the line with the box, the national province, we can see that in grade 5 maths, the percent of learners in a class exceeding 50 increased from 16% of learners in a class exceeding 50 to 34% of learners in a maths class in grade 5 exceeding 50. So over this period, there has been dramatic increase in maths class sizes. But at the same time, the learner-educator ratio fell from 36 to 32. So now there are more teachers for every learner, at least nationally, but at the same time, maths classes are getting bigger. So it presents a bit of a conundrum. And then to see this more, how another aspect of these dynamics, the learner-educator ratio, so how many kids there are for every teacher, increased slightly from 28.9 to 29.4. Well, at the same time, class sizes decreased. So there's clearly quite a lot of slack in the system. Yeah, so basically there are now fewer, between 2018 and 2021, there were fewer educators for every learner, but at the same time, class sizes got smaller. So continuing this trend of reducing class size is critical. I have a paper coming up that deals with this. Okay, I see I mentioned it here. So to understand this graph, it's a bit messy, but this really drives home how much inefficiency there is in the allocation of learners and teachers to classes. So if we follow this graph and we look at the x-axis, the school learner-educator ratio, how many learners there are for every educator. In a school with 42 learners for every educator, in the Free State, 23% of learners are in classes exceeding 50. In an equivalent school with 42 learners for every educator, in Limpopo, 50% of learners are in classes exceeding 50. So these are schools that are equivalently capacitated. They have the same number of educators for every learner, and yet the kids in Limpopo are more than double the number of kids in Limpopo are sitting in classes exceeding 50 in such a school. So yeah, there's very dramatic interprovincial inequality in how effective schools are at human resourcing. Yeah, so then I'll just start with this last bullet point. My latest research shows that we could maintain current class sizes with 22% fewer educators. The flip side of this is that we could reduce class sizes for the current number of educators we have by just over 20% as well. So when we currently have an extraordinary problem with the number of teachers retiring potentially. It must be very carefully considered how we go forward with addressing these kinds of dynamics, when at the end of the day, what we ultimately care about when we think about how many educators there are in the system is how big classes are. And class sizes are extraordinarily large. So the evidence shows that class size doesn't affect learning outcomes. Very controversial, but it seems quite robust. We see this in South Africa, that class sizes don't affect learning outcomes. And we see in Kenya the same dynamic, even very substantial reductions in class size. From 82 to 44 learners, there is no improvement in learning outcomes. And under reduction and then under increasing classes from 54 to 100 learners, there is no deterioration in outcomes in the Philippines or India. So why do we still care about class size if it doesn't affect learning outcomes? Well, quite fundamentally, we have a huge number of teachers teaching more than 50 learners. Very large percent of classes are more than 50 learners, which has substantial human rights implications for the learners, for the teachers, and also quality of job. You know, it's very hard to attract and maintain teachers when they're teaching under such circumstances. But yeah, it's good to be clear about why we care about class sizes and how to think about what solutions we propose depending on what outcome we're trying to drive. Then we can again look at the persistence of the effects of apartheid. We can see that multi-grade schools, so these are schools where different grades of learners are being taught in the same class. So for example, a grade 5 learner and a grade 4 learner who are being taught together. These schools are bad pedagogically because they impede teaching at the right level, so appropriate teaching. It's quite hard to teach the grade 4 and grade 5 curriculum at the same time. And these schools are often very small schools, and they're predominantly found in the former homelands. So many of these schools are holdover schools from the Bantu education system, although it's hard to identify exactly how many of them were built pre and post apartheid. And we have a very large number of them. So there are just over 5,300 schools out of 24,000 that are multi-grade schools. So the other way to think about this is these are schools with more grades than teachers. So you have grade 1 to 7, but only 3 teachers to teach each of those 7 grades. So yeah, this is pedagogical consequences, and it also has fiscal consequences because each of these schools needs a principal, and presumably these principals are an appropriate principal pay run. And these schools also experience high fixed costs, such as delivery of materials to the school or maintenance. These things can be shared, can't be shared between schools very easily. So what do we do about it? It seems like there's quite a lot of scope to do something about these schools. Already the Free State has closed 25% of small schools, sorry, of all schools, most of which were small schools. KZN is also beginning to look at what kind of rationalization can take place. And if we look at the numbers of learners in the Eastern Cape, there are 270,000 learners in these multi-grade schools. In KZN, it's 160,000, and in Limpopo, it's 130,000. I also have a paper or a research note published this year that tries to work out whether walking distance, whether we can close schools without reducing access. And basically what I do is I check that the current total area or distance that learners are walking to get to school isn't increased when a school is removed. And I show that there are up to 2,000 schools we could close in South Africa without increasing the distance learners need to walk to get to school. So yeah, and then finally to just say that these small schools are also, even though they're multi-grade schools, there are still more educators for every learner. So they have a higher learner-educator ratio, which is what I show in this dot figure in the bottom. So now we move to post-secondary education and training. And I'm looking at NSFAS here specifically. This is the scholarship program for teachers. As the topic of this discussion is education under fiscal consolidation, again, I'm trying to look at where the education system is excelling and where we might find some scope for rationalization. Yeah, so we saw that entrance into university with non-completion or funding cessation is extremely traumatic a process. It doesn't seem right to me to accept learners into the education system that we can be, into university that we can be fairly certain will not complete. There are, depending on how you look at it, around 30%, although I have the exact number in the report. I can't remember it exactly, but a very large number of entrants into university never complete. And this is quite a problem, especially because there's good reason to believe that NSC and NBT results are predictive of who will and who will not complete. So yeah, accepting a learner you know will not complete, although that provides funding for the university, it doesn't seem right to me. And if we look at this in the context of NSFAS, we can see that 44% don't graduate within 5 years and 35% don't graduate within 6 years. So that's the maximum period of receipt. So if they continue after 6 years, which we can see on the figure on the right, there is an increasing number of learners who remain in university, and a high number of them do eventually graduate, but this is likely very costly to at least themselves after the 6-year period. And then in the data, at least historically, although to my knowledge, this data hasn't been publicly available since 2013, there is a very long tail of NSFAS recipients who are receiving NSFAS funding 10 years after first receipt. So they should have been cut off at most 6 years after first receipt, yet there's this long tail of continuing recipients. Yeah, worth noting though that NSFAS learners do graduate at higher rates than non-NSFAS recipients, and yeah, and I know there's quite a lot of political and logistical problems with actually getting NSFAS trained teachers into schools. Then again, moving to this economic growth theme, we might want to ask whether our employment priorities are reflected in post-secondary education enrollment categories. So currently 1 in 5 university learners is enrolled in an education program, and this has meant that there is to my understanding, quite a substantial stock of unemployed educators, a buffer, which we do need for the coming retirement wave, but it's not clear how many of these unemployed educator graduates exactly is needed. And then if we open that category more widely and include both education and other humanities, 50% of all post-secondary enrolled learners are studying a humanities degree. Yeah, so I think, you know, of course the humanities are very important, but there's a good question about whether we can sustainably fund the humanities if we are not producing enough taxpayers to, fund the humanities long run. So I think it's good to never think of these things as completely zero-sum. There are good long-run reasons, even internally, to the maintenance of humanities programs to ensure that a country like South Africa, facing the fiscal cliff it is facing, is able to, in the long run, sustain these kinds of programs. This was perhaps the single most surprising part of the research I did for this paper. Sorry, I didn't note at the beginning, but I'll be stopping in about 10 minutes to take questions. Maybe a little longer, but I'll try and keep it to 10 to 3. So in South Africa, we have the Skills Development Levy. This is a tax on every employed, it's a 1% tax on every employed person at your company. And this tax goes to skills training. About 80% goes to the SETAs, and some of it goes to the National Skills Fund. And then I think that most of the remainder goes to the National Skills Fund. And currently, and for a while, in fact, since 2014, the cost of a person enrolled in a SETA program per person enrolled is higher than the cost of an enrolled university, someone enrolled in university, which is particularly extraordinary because the SETAs do not have research obligations. So these numbers are looking at the total cost of universities divided by the total number of enrolled learners per year, and likewise with the SETAs. So universities have statutory research obligations, and a much higher fraction of university enrolled learners are there full-time, whereas SETA enrollments are often short programs, and yet after both of these facts are considered, the enrollment of a learner in a SETA program is higher than university. And on top of this, there is, from my understanding, no research that shows that the government is getting a positive return on investment from SETA or skills development levy programs. And yeah, to put another number on this, the cost of non-qualifying learners, so those that are in a SETA program but will never get a qualification, is 2.7 billion annually. And then another very important fact here is that the skills development levy bucks most accepted best practices for budgeting. It is an earmarked tax, and it taxes one of the most precarious parts of the South African economy. It's a direct tax on employment. So when we think about something like the employment tax incentive, which is actively trying to increase youth employment, we currently spend 6 billion on this incentive, and we might hope that that incentive has some positive effect on employment. And at the same time, we are taxing employment by 19 billion every year. So we're net disincentivizing employment in a country with north of 40% broad unemployment by 13 billion rand every year to fund a system that, as I say, there is no very strong evidence that we are getting a return on investment for these SETA programs. And also to just look at it briefly, structurally, there are 21 SETAs with multiple concurrent obligations, and there's a transition to the QCTO, but again, no evidence this has reduced costs. So I've left myself with very little time for policies. Just to say there's been some exceptionally good education reviews in South Africa. And this is a kind of matrix of policy recommendations by feasibility and impact. So in the top right, I'll just talk through these, but the rest of the slides explain each of these proposals. These are proposals that are drawn mostly from DBE and national planning documents. I don't think any of these are my own recommendations, so this is just highlighting what I found as the most salient policy proposals or policy documents that the government has produced itself, with maybe one exception, which is educator. Oh no, sorry, even educator and principal licensure, like an assessment that principals have to do at least, that comes from the DBE year review from a few years back. But to start in the top right corner, we have national diagnostic assessments. So these are like those international assessments we looked at earlier, except they're run by the these are national diagnostic assessments are basically tests that teachers can use that are produced nationally. So instead of every year for every subject, teachers having to reproduce set tests for their learners, this would create a test bank of high quality assessments that teachers can use. I put this as the most feasible because it will dramatically decrease well, not dramatically, but it'll substantially decrease the administrative tasks that teachers have, which from recent Stellenbosch research, most teachers say is their primary reason for wishing to leave the profession. Having this test bank would reduce that cost, and it also has very high pedagogical merit because it allows teachers to understand exactly where their learners are by national standards, and would provide a neat progression of learning and subjects. And then focus schools as magnet schools. So I've already talked about using our best schools to be selective, like Vietnam has done very successfully. I've already spoken about professional licensure. If 60% of teachers are unable to pass their subject, clearly there needs to be something beyond the Bachelor of Education, I think, before teachers are allowed to teach. One of the lowest cost things we could do is to implement the comprehensive literacy plan outlined in the Identifying Binding Constraints report. There is also the EGRA, which is the early grade reading program, and both of these, when the cost analysis is very low, with incredible outcomes in terms of literacy, which of course is the foundation of all future learning. Post-secondary education training, integration and rationalization, spoken about that. I think it's implicit. Realigning the OSD notches with their intended goal. So there were several wage agreements that rendered the OSD notches to not be incentivizing performance. So, I think it's will never happen that we see real long-term decline in average teacher salaries, but we could at least be using these very high yearly increments to incentivize the best teachers to remain, and the best university entrants to go into teaching, because teacher quality is very, very important. And then systemic evaluations in the top left are evaluations like the international evaluations that are comparable across time and across province. And this will allow us to understand at a much more granular level exactly how the education system is doing. And it's something we don't currently have. The Western Cape has something like this, but it doesn't often make its data widely available. So there are both sides of the coin in terms of the production and the use of these kinds of data. But yeah, we need this. We need this in grade 3, 6, 9, and 12. And this would be a sample assessment. So it's much lower cost than, for example, the failed annual national assessments, which were maybe failed as strong, the discontinued annual national assessments, which assessed every learner in the country. In terms of post-secondary, the Davis Tax Commission outlines a fantastic model for funding. And then in bottom left, we've now legislated the universal grade R. But the best research in South Africa showed that expansion of grade R did not improve learning outcomes. And there are also risks associated with removing learners from their caregivers from at younger ages without the universal quality assurance that we might hope be in place before such an expansion. Yeah, so my only claim here is not that this will be good or bad, the expansion of grade R. My claim is that we do not have the evidence to understand what is going to be the consequences or the benefits of this expansion. But yeah, put that at least feasible because that's already gone ahead. Yeah, and then this is just basically a summary of understanding each of these, each of those policy suggestions. And yeah, 1 minute late, but there we are.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for such an insightful and informative presentation. We already have 3 questions on the chat. Thank you so much. And if we can just give Peter a round of applause for such an informative session. Thank you.
Sure. Shall I go through the chat? Is there a correlation between the inequality?
Yes, please.
Is there a correlation between the inequality of class sizes and geographical access to schools? I can imagine remote schools have far fewer learners than those in urban areas. Yeah, so it's definitely there's an urban-rural divide, but the fascinating thing in South Africa is because of the legacy of Bantu education. In the rural areas, there is quite high population density and an even higher density of schools. So we have the ratio of schools to learners is very, very high in the former homelands. And this is means that the schools are very small, very few learners, and even then they don't have enough teachers because there aren't enough learners to pay for those teachers in these schools. So there's definitely a geographic aspect both across provinces and within provinces, and defined almost wholly by the former homelands. So yeah, it's important to consider just how sticky the costs of apartheid have been and will continue to be. AJ says, thanks, Peter. How should we interpret South Africa getting a record matric pass for the class of 2024 ever, having spent their entire high school during COVID and South African schools having endured the largest COVID learning losses? Anthony. So as I say, the matric is not psychometrically comparable across time. So it's quite hard to say in either direction. It's worth noting that the Pearls was much younger learners than the NSC. So there might be quite a big divide just in terms of how much COVID impacts young learners versus old learners. But I think this points more towards having more robust thermometers, quote unquote, for the South African education system. We need to have a nationally representative sample of learners randomly taking assessments in grade 3, 6, 9, and 12 and use that as our national benchmarks for learning instead of putting all the pressure on the NSC, which is not designed for that role of providing evidence about the education system as a whole. Yeah, hope that answers that. Mamiki says, it seems by observation that increased education hasn't automatically translated into sustained economic development in South Africa to align with modern needs. If any, does curriculum reform align with economic needs, aligned at employment needs creation education outcomes. Yeah, so I think I really should have outlined, which was the tagline for this presentation, is why South Africa has experienced this 10 years of extraordinary improvement, which I outlined, yet over the subsequent 10 years, we have not been able to translate that into economic growth. And of course, you can point to Eskom or any number of particular reasons why we haven't experienced economic growth. But even internally within the education system, we have seen almost all those improvements at the bottom end of the learning distribution. So we haven't seen a dramatic rise in the number of learners getting advanced degrees in STEM subjects. So where the education data is showing us we're seeing high returns to education is exactly where we are not getting dramatic improvements in the learning system. So this is, it's very laudable in one sense because this has reduced inequality by focusing on learners at the bottom of the learning distribution, who of course come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. But at the same time, it's prevented us being able to continue that sustainably because we haven't been able to translate that into high earning future taxpayers. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly if that answers the question, but hopefully it does. Spencer?
Hi, thanks, Peter, for a great presentation and a very insightful paper. It's obviously a very tough assignment that you took on here because you're looking across the entire education spectrum. So well done for what you've achieved so far. I just have a couple of questions and maybe a comment or two. So the first one is the discrepancy between the learner-educator ratio and class size is, as you said, a complex one, but do you have any ideas of what can be done to, well, obviously what is creating this problem in Limpopo, for example, by comparison to the Free State, and how then can that be addressed, or what needs to be done to address that? Because as you point out too, you could reduce class sizes without increasing the number of teachers. So just give us a little bit of insight as to what to do in order to do that. Then the very concerning part of the paper and presentation for me is the low level of teacher competence. What do we do about that? So just to frame that question a little bit, the teachers coming out of universities now, the teachers qualifying now for the past, say, 15 years, have a degree, a 4-year degree, or a degree and a PGCE diploma. And is it those teachers who are having the problem? Or is it across the board, or is the problem mainly with teachers from before? So in other words, is it a problem that we can fix with in-service training, or is it a problem that we need to address across the board, including what they're teaching at university today still? And then just a comment quickly on the skills development. I know that the CETA system is inefficient. It's probably, your work shows, is probably the most inefficient system in this the combined sector. But I don't think the answer is to get rid of it. I think we still need skills development of people who are in the workplace, because the workplace is changing so rapidly that you may even be well capacitated when you join a particular sector, a work sector, but with changes happening, your skills need to be adapted, and you may need some upgraded training or whatever. and this is still necessary. So I don't know. I don't think the CETA system is the solution, but I think that is still something that we require more broadly. But thanks, Peter. Thanks for your presentation and paper.
Thank you, Spencer, and also just thank you for your very long dedicated work on education yourself. Yeah, on the learner-educator ratio and class size discrepancy, I think this is a very interesting problem, and it's very substantial. So some of the reasons why we might expect this to be happening is, for example, if there aren't enough classrooms. So you have 5 teachers and 4 classrooms, so the average class size is very large. And indeed, the driving force behind these large class sizes is that there are excess teachers, full-time teachers for every class. So there might be grade 4A, 4B, 4C, so a school with 3 classes, and there are 5 or 6 teachers in the school, excluding the principal. So it seems like there is a utilization problem at the heart of this. Teachers are simply not teaching every period of every day. And this is evidence coming from even primary schools. So this is before thinking about the complications of timetabling and subject issues that arise in high school. And we also know that this is a solvable problem because many provinces don't seem to have as large a problem with this underutilization of teachers. It's difficult because the two competing forces here is presumably teachers want to be teaching small classes, but they also want to be teaching as few classes as possible during a given school day. And it appears that the preference to teach large classes for fewer periods during a given day is winning. And it's winning so much so that just getting rid of, or rather ensuring that every teacher has a class every period of the day. If we did that in South Africa, the numbers show that we would be able to reduce class sizes by up to 20%. So there is something extraordinary happening within schools. This is all coming from administrative data, and this work is very preliminary. We need a lot more research into what is happening on the ground. So I'll say that both of those statements come with very large pinches of salt. On teacher content knowledge, again, this is very difficult because our most recent data is now quite outdated. So it's hard to know, the education system now has near universal degreed teachers. So doesn't seem like it would at this point be the problem of underqualified teachers. But there is good reason to think that these qualifications are not reflective of the content knowledge that we expect of our teachers. So I have suggested in this work that there needs to be a externally sat assessment for teachers. I unfortunately think that to take a one step back, the fundamental problem we have is a generational one. An education system needs highly educated teachers, and to get highly educated teachers, you need highly educated teachers. So the scars of apartheid on these kinds of problems are very profound, and it's hard to just jump ahead and suddenly find 400,000 teachers from a previously completely dysfunctional education system. So yeah, I think it is a sticky problem. I think it gets down to the cycles of poverty that South Africa has to deal with. And yeah, I don't really know. I don't think in-service training is going to work, because everything we see in the education system is that the effects of poor education compound. So if you don't get foundational literacy and numeracy in grade before, in early education in primary school, then by the time you're in high school, you have missed so much schooling because of your missed foundational skills that these effects compound. So I think the likelihood is that if we haven't caught this problem, quite early on in the life cycle of education, it seems unlikely to me that you can take these 60% of teachers who were not passing maths in at the grade 6 level and get them to now perform at a much higher level through a few weeks a year. But maybe there is some hope there. I don't know. On the CETAs, this is not my area of research, so I don't want to say too much about this, but I will say everything I've looked into does not bode well at a structural level. The CETAs do not seem set up to me to have any kind of structure that ensures there is well incentivized funding and production of knowledge. So, for example, the SDL, the company that sponsors the training, will get money back regardless of the quality of the course of training. So they're incentivized to find the cheapest possible course and get their employees to take that course. So I agree there needs to be something, but I am very pessimistic that that's something, should one be taxed from taxing employment, that just goes against all foundational principles of good budgeting. And I don't think that the current model of either QCTO or CETAs is quite right. I think we need to do what the Department of Higher Education has said for years and years and years, which is tracer studies. We need to follow people from programs all the way through their life and see what programs are actually getting return on investment in terms of employment, and fund those programs. And unless we have the evidence and the programs to build that evidence, I am going to be very dubious of any claims for effective programs that are costing nearly 20 billion rand a year in our current fiscal situation. Yeah, thanks for those great questions, Spencer. Dr. E.T. Confidence, I can't quite see the rest of your name. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to just comment and also to ask questions. Let me just start by saying that you have done well done with what you have given us today. You did a good job. However, I think that we might have to look to other factors also that affect education and economic growth negatively. And as you said, as you were wrapping up just now, we definitely need more research on the questions that are facing us. My comment on the first 10 years of democracy is that they were overall excellent in terms of performance of government. And that was tied to a very great extent to the reconstruction and development, and the authority that the government in those first 5 years had, which was associated with the energy of freedom. For example, if you look at infrastructure delivery, whether it is the roads or the schools or the clinics, you'll find that the performance of the first 5 years is in fact not even exceeded by the performance of the 25 years that followed that. Now, the topic touching on inclusive economic growth and education policy during the fiscal consolidation, I would just say that unemployment and the chronic low economic growth trap are structuralized, and that is why it's not only education that will be able to resolve that. You did say that you are not that glued with issues of the CETAs, but I'm very concerned that you made a statement that there's a very low return on investments in students who are enrolled in CETA-associated programs. As a former chairperson of the forum of all chairpersons of all the CETAs, I do think that this statement needs to be properly researched. As my experience of the SETA sector and also the practices of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, where the college sector contributes to appropriate skills provision in line with the triangle of skills provision. I do think that in South Africa, the problem that we are having is that we have made everything to rotate around the universities, and we are not leveraging what we are supposed to leverage from the college, from the colleges and the industry. And the triangle of skills provision says that for one engineer, you have got 4 technicians. And for each technician, you have got 1 to 16 artisans. And under artisans, you have got tradesmen and tradeswomen. You can see that the university was supposed to be giving us 1 out of 256 skilled people that are supposed to be driving the economy. Now, one thing that I feel you did not touch upon is a question of the declining professionalism across the board. If you look at the declining professionalism and the low competence of teachers and other professionals, you'll see that it cuts across all the sectors. It might be because university trains professionals with little or no work-integrated learning are a hazard. Teachers cannot teach, nurses cannot nurse, and many of them cannot even deliver babies because they are no more exposed to enough time to be able to deliver. That is why we have got teachers, nurses, and doctors and blue-collar workers whose professionalism is in question. Maybe the distraction of both the curriculum and the pedagogy across the professions and the lack of emphasis of work-integrated learning and the negative effects of access to money, especially through NSFAS, too much access to money through NSFAS as opposed to previously before 1994, when the funding of students was there, but it was not money into the pocket of the students. The last thing that I just want to mention is that I'm disappointed that this presentation only speaks of schools and universities without considering the college sector, which includes technical and vocational education and a lot of work-integrated learning. The very last thing is that you did talk about the cost of apartheid. I'm very skeptical as a product of the apartheid education. 30 years of democracy should be putting us in a position where we are not blaming apartheid anymore. At the height of apartheid, we had structures such as the Vets Education Policy Unit, the National Education Coordinating Committee, the internal chapter of the Department of Manpower Development, and other NGOs that were producing professionals, some of them who are serving, including, for example, our very own head of the Reserve Bank. And it ensured that we produced high quality professionals in anticipation of freedom that was inevitable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very insightful comments there. Yeah, so just to clarify the focus of this presentation, I was specifically asked to look at the subjects, which I did, on whether the SETAs are getting performance or returns. I think that the funding that the SETAs get is extraordinary. They get a lot of, have had that funding now for more than 20 years. And that with that funding, they do occasionally do research. And thus far, to my approximation, I have not been able to find any evidence that we are seeing high employment returns to SETA graduates. And when we compare this to university graduates, nationally, there's just over 8% unemployment rate for university graduates, which is high. But if you look at the subfields, the STEM graduates, they are not only have extremely low unemployment rates, but their remuneration is very, very high, even by international standards. So, a manager in a factory in South Africa will get paid double the equivalent job of a factory manager in, Thailand or something. So it does seem to me that the burden of proof lies on the SETAs if they're going to, or the QCTO, if they're going to continue to receive the kinds of funding that they do. Yeah, and then and I would also expect to see it in the macroeconomics of the situation. Other tertiary includes all the skills programs, and 21%. We see 21% unemployment there. So it is lower than matric for sure. But yeah, it's not clear to me that what we're paying for that sector, we're getting strong returns for it. But yeah, I think my ultimate claim here is that the evidence doesn't exist. It could exist. Why doesn't it exist? And should we be paying 20 billion rand a year for programs that there is no evidence for? And then on the continuation of the harms of apartheid, I definitely agree. I don't want to paint a universal brush. I'm more talking about the national aggregates. So I think there were definitely bright spots, certainly bright spots pre-democracy. And as you have clearly highlighted, many of South Africa's brightest luminaries have come from these sectors. But it's quite clear that if we look at any of the numbers, or if we look at where learners do poorly, it continues to be in the former apartheid homelands. So even today, for young students on the ground, the geographic persistence of apartheid has direct bearing on learning outcomes. And then, to me, the numbers about that the gap in teacher content knowledge is more determined by age than by the socioeconomic status of provinces. That I don't think there are many other countries that are seeing such dramatic differences that lie almost perfectly on the border of how many years of exposure you had to democratic education. So perhaps a better frame isn't how terrible Bantu education was on aggregate, but rather how much improvement we've seen post-apartheid, and how exceptionally profound exposure to the post-apartheid education system has been on educators. Yeah, but thanks again for those comments. Yeah.
Sorry, Peter. I was just saying we need to start wrapping up. Maybe you can take the two more comments on the chat, which is from Amanda and Rachel, and then we can take one more question from the hand up, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, so there's a question on teaching assistants. Are they contributing to enhanced quality? I think that when they're hired and vetted, as they did with Wunda, C. Spencer has commented, the effects are very good, but I very much doubt that we're going to see at least improvements in learning from hiring near recent matriculants and putting them in classrooms. That being said, I think there's potentially, good non-learning reasons to hire these learners, such as human rights, like what is a classroom environment with one teacher in front of 50 plus learners. So I would support perhaps a supporting role, but I wouldn't expect it to have large increases in learning. And again, I think that the lack of evidence-based policy making in South Africa around these kinds of things is sometimes frustrating. This is a prime possible example of a program that could have been highly researched before it was implemented at quite substantial cost. Yeah, I think we've become too accustomed to not having paying 10, 11% over 5 years on our debt while the economy grows at 1%. This is an extraordinary position to find ourselves in, and it calls for extraordinary consideration for how we spend. Yeah. Barrelang?
Yeah. Yes. Hi, Peter. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to just also get on to the issue on the skills development levy. Based on your research, are there any international best practices for skills development, maybe levies that you've seen, and what their research shows and recommendations, and how maybe other countries have actually used this levy to their benefit based on all the challenges and inefficiencies that we have specifically in that sector? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess there's two sides of this. There's the tax side and there's the spend side. And on the tax side, this is quite universally understood as not budgeting best practices. Levies on specific things that are earmarked for specific spend just isn't how modern budgets should work. There should be parliamentary and oversight on, you know, what is taxed and where it goes. To have an earmarked tax just is not correct, in my opinion. And yeah, for it to be a tax on employment itself, that in a country with the employment problem we have, I really think that is troublesome. So I'm not saying these programs, that there should be no programs that aren't university or basic education. Of course there should be. I think there is good reason for thinking that they should be expanded. You know, many people talk about the shortage of plumbers every year on the labor market intelligence units list of high demand people. There, you know, a long list of non-university skills that need to be trained for. But I think perhaps, again, this isn't my area of expertise. I can more confidently speak about the tax side than the spend side. But I think, you know, there are models that we could be copying. Like I'm hesitant to use developed countries like Germany as an example, but they have apprenticeship programs and other programs that ensure there is alignment between the employer and employee and the learning that's taking place. Yeah, and to be even more agnostic, I'd be very happy for there are potentially extraordinary bright spots within the CETA system. You did this course from this CETA and now 90% of graduates have employment. I think that's possible, but we don't know this, and we should know this, and we could know this. And I think the onus is on the CETAs to produce that evidence and motivate for the extraordinary funding they get. And then I think that funding should come from appropriate budgeting principles. You know, they should be taxed from whatever the most efficient thing to tax is. Yeah, so I do hope that much more research goes into the sector and we come up with solutions, because it is a critical thing to get right, and it doesn't seem like we yet know what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong. Yeah. I think that's everyone.
Yes, it is, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for such a thought-provoking session and a rich research that you've done on this. And everyone, thank you very much for joining us this Friday again. And the presentation will be shared on our Knowledge Hub and YouTube channel. And the link, I've posted it on the link. And one more thing, if you could kindly take a survey and rate us, how was the webinar, how was the session, and where can we improve? Thank you so much. And I've posted all the links on the chat.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the attendance very much. Yeah, after working for so long on this, it's good to see people are interested. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye.
Peter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.